A fateful encounter. Officer James Carson, known simply as Jake to his colleagues, was a recent addition to the city's police force. Fresh out of the academy, he had come with high hopes of making a difference, perhaps even making a name for himself in this sprawling urban landscape. His background was one of discipline, structure, and unwavering authority. A small-town upbringing with a father whose words still echoed in his mind. "Don't let anyone tell you how things work, son. You're the one in charge." Those words had shaped Jake's approach to life, to his work, and, on some level, to his very identity as a police officer. Jake had been assigned to patrol a high-end shopping district, an area known for its luxury boutiques, opulent restaurants, and clientele who wore their affluence as naturally as their designer clothes. The neighborhood was quiet on this particular Saturday, with a gentle hum of activity as people strolled along the cobblestone streets. It was a warm afternoon, the kind that encouraged people to move leisurely, enjoying the gentle breeze that swept through the avenue. Jake watched the patrons pass by, couples hand in hand, families chatting over coffee, groups of friends laughing as they took in the ambience. He scanned them with the keen eye he believed to be essential for his duty. Unlike his seasoned colleagues, who found peace in these surroundings, Jake's gaze never relaxed. To him, tranquility was merely a facade, a thin veil beneath which threats could lurk undetected. He had cultivated a habit of vigilance, an instinct honed by years of his father's teachings and reinforced by his recent training. While the other officers might view this assignment as a routine patrol, a quiet beat with little action, Jake saw it differently. He took his duty seriously, watching everyone with a meticulous eye, ensuring that nothing slipped past his radar. As he moved down the street, a solitary figure caught his attention near the entrance of a trendy French bistro. Standing alone, just outside the restaurant's door, was a woman, poised, composed, and radiating an air of quiet confidence. She wore a navy suit tailored to perfection, her stance firm yet unhurried, as though she belonged there yet held a purpose that wasn't immediately visible. Jake narrowed his eyes, the instinctual questions forming in his mind. Who was she? Why was she alone? Did she fit the mold of someone who belonged in this neighborhood? His father's words reverberated in his mind, a constant reminder of his upbringing. His father had always emphasized that control was the cornerstone of authority, that one's presence alone should be enough to command respect and compliance. Jake took this mantra to heart, even if it meant projecting a sternness that set him apart from his more relaxed colleagues. They were soft, he often thought, unwilling to take the initiative to root out potential problems. But Jake wasn't here to make friends. He was here to prove himself, to show that he could maintain order no matter where he was assigned. As Jake's eyes lingered on the woman, her calm demeanor unsettled him. The patrons around her appeared to blend into the scenery, lost in their routines, but this woman stood apart. There was a sense of presence about her that Jake couldn't quite place, a self-assurance that defied the passive, carefree energy of the district. She wasn't scrolling on her phone or fidgeting with a shopping bag. She simply stood there, glancing occasionally at her watch, as if waiting for someone. Her stillness struck him as odd, even suspicious. He moved his hand toward his radio, considering whether to call for backup or at least notify the team about a potential disturbance. But then he stopped himself. No, he could handle this alone. He was a police officer, trained and equipped to assess situations and manage them effectively. He had envisioned moments like this, moments when he would be the one to step in, to control a potentially volatile situation. He felt a surge of adrenaline as he decided to approach her, his steps purposeful, his posture upright, embodying the authority he believed came with his badge. As he closed the distance, Jake took a deep breath, preparing himself for the encounter. He had always imagined that asserting his presence would be straightforward, that people would respond to his authority as naturally as they would to a command. It was, in his view, a matter of maintaining the upper hand from the very start, of showing that he was in charge. He stopped a few feet from her, his voice steady yet firm. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying the weight of his authority. mind telling me what you're doing here?" The woman turned toward him slowly, her expression revealing only a trace of surprise. Her gaze was steady, her posture unmoved. She didn't respond immediately, but instead assessed him with a calm, unreadable expression that somehow unsettled him. When their eyes met, he felt a flicker of uncertainty, a sensation he hadn't anticipated. She was confident, almost unbothered, as if she had expected him to approach. And there was something in her eyes, a glint that hinted she was accustomed to these situations, that she was not easily intimidated. Jake felt his grip on the situation slipping slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. His usual method of asserting dominance, of projecting authority, didn't seem to be having the effect he intended. She wasn't intimidated. If anything, she appeared more intrigued than concerned. "Waiting for someone," she replied, her tone as calm as her gaze. There was no trace of anxiety or defensiveness in her voice, just a quiet assertiveness that mirrored his own, almost as though she was challenging his authority without uttering a single accusatory word. He found himself disarmed by her composure, thrown off balance by the ease with which she met his question. Jake cleared his throat, attempting to reassert himself. "We've had a few incidents in this area," he continued, though in reality, he hadn't been aware of any recent disturbances. He told himself it was simply a precautionary approach, but deep down, he knew he was reaching, searching for a way to justify his unease. "I'm just doing my job, ensuring everything is as it should be." The woman raised a brow, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And you think I'm causing an incident?" she asked, her tone light yet laced with an underlying challenge. Her words hung in the air between them, a subtle test of his response. It was as though she was daring him to find something more to justify his scrutiny. Jake felt his cheeks flush slightly, an unexpected reaction that he quickly tried to conceal. He reminded himself of his training, of the importance of composure, but her poise was affecting him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I just want to be sure everything's in order, Mom," he replied, trying to keep his tone steady, authoritative. But even as he spoke, he sensed that his words held less conviction than he'd intended. She held his gaze for a moment longer before glancing down at her watch, her expression unchanging. "Well, Officer Carson, was it?" she asked, her voice calm yet somehow piercing. The fact that she knew his name surprised him. He hadn't introduced himself. How did she know? "Yes, Carson," he replied, his voice a bit softer now, betraying the slightest hint of curiosity. The balance of control, he realized, was beginning to shift in a way he hadn't expected. Unmasking assumptions. Maya Thompson stood tall, her posture unwavering, meeting Officer Carson's gaze with a quiet authority that seemed to counter his intent. From the moment he'd approach, she'd read him like an open book, his stern tone, his barely concealed suspicion, and the forced composure all spoke volumes. Maya wasn't unfamiliar with situations like these. In her position, she'd encountered countless people who'd made assumptions about her based on first impressions, often casting her as something she wasn't. But what Officer Carson didn't know was that Maya was no ordinary citizen. Behind her unassuming demeanor and the sophisticated suit was a seasoned police captain from the neighboring precinct, well-versed in the dynamics of power and authority. And unlike Carson, she didn't need to project her authority. It radiated naturally from her experience, her confidence, and her genuine belief in justice, a belief that she knew too well was sometimes lacking in others. For now, she was content to observe, allowing Carson to carry on in his role, probing her with questions under the guise of ensuring safety. He'd learned soon enough who she was, but Maya wanted to see how he handled himself first. Officer Carson shifted, his face displaying a hint of discomfort as he attempted to maintain control of the situation. The slight flush on his cheeks revealed a glimpse of insecurity, a telltale sign of someone unaccustomed to being challenged, especially by someone who didn't back down. This reaction amused Maya, though she didn't let it show. There was a lesson here, one she hoped he might learn from. Unmoved, she looked at him, measuring her words carefully. I'm simply waiting for someone. Is that a problem in this neighborhood, officer? Carson stiffened. Her question was direct, and he felt the sharpness in her tone. It wasn't an outright challenge, but it was enough to make him rethink his approach. His instincts, trained and honed through years of discipline, had always led him to believe that authority required a firm hand, that respect was something to be demanded rather than earned. Yet, here was a woman who seemed to radiate a natural authority without raising her voice or asserting herself. She was simply there, unbothered, as if his presence were a minor inconvenience rather than a legitimate threat. Clearing his throat, he glanced around at the curious bystanders who had begun to notice the scene. A small crowd was gathering, their eyes shifting between him and Maya, subtle expressions of curiosity, and in some cases, disapproval. Jake realized that this interaction wasn't unfolding as planned. Usually, his authoritative presence alone was enough to keep people compliant, but Maya was different. "Look, Mom," he said, lowering his voice slightly, as though attempting to reframe the conversation. "I'm just doing my job, making sure everything's safe. You might understand that it's unusual to see someone standing alone here without any obvious purpose." Maya raised an eyebrow, her patience wearing thin. "Unusual to see a woman alone," she replied, her tone controlled but piercing. "Or is it just unusual to see someone who doesn't fit your assumptions?" The question caught Jake off guard, and for a brief moment, he struggled to find an appropriate response. She was right, and he knew it, though he was reluctant to admit it even to himself. He'd come over because she didn't fit into the image he associated with this upscale district. The truth of it made him uncomfortable, and yet the idea of letting her go without fully asserting his role was equally unsettling. Trying to regain his footing, he glanced again at her attire. The tailored navy suit, polished shoes, and the neatly arranged documents poking out of a leather briefcase beside her. In retrospect, she looked far more professional and put together than anyone else in the area, but he hadn't allowed himself to see that. His mind had simply registered a single, unqualified notion, out of place, and he'd let that single assumption dictate his entire approach. Determined to follow through, Jake decided to continue the conversation, hoping to learn more about her without giving up his perceived authority. "You have to understand," he said, taking a slightly softer tone. "We're here to protect this area, keep everyone safe, and sometimes that means asking questions, making sure there's nothing suspicious going on. It's not personal." Maya studied him quietly for a moment, a glimmer of empathy flickering in her eyes. She could sense that Jake's behavior wasn't entirely malicious, but rather misguided. A young officer still bound by his assumptions, still trying to live up to an image of control he'd likely been taught all his life. She recognized that image. After all, she'd once been like him. Deciding to extend a small olive branch, Maya offered a gentle smile, though her words remained firm. "I understand, Officer Carson. Believe me, I understand what it's like to want to keep people safe. But safety doesn't come from targeting people just because they don't fit a mold. It comes from building trust, from seeing people as they are, not as you expect them to be." Her words struck a nerve, and Jake felt his defenses rise instinctively. "With all due respect, Mom," he replied, his voice tightening, "I've been trained to assess situations, to detect potential threats. That's part of my job." Maya nodded, but there was a trace of sadness in her eyes, as if she had heard those words 100 times before. "And how long have you been on the job, Officer Carson?" The question hung in the air, and Jake felt an unexpected embarrassment wash over him. "Just a few months," he admitted, though the words came reluctantly. He didn't like being reminded of his lack of experience, especially not by a civilian, even one as composed as Maya. "I see," she replied, her voice softening. She hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully, before continuing. "I've been on the job for a lot longer, Officer Carson. Longer than you might think." Jake's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. He looked at her again, This time, not as a suspicious figure or an anomaly in the crowd, but as someone who carried an air of experience, of understanding. It was then that he noticed a small badge clipped discreetly inside her briefcase, partially hidden beneath the papers. The sight of it made his breath catch. "You're with the police?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might confirm his mistake. Maya simply nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "Yes, Officer Carson. I am Captain Maya Thompson from the 12th Precinct. I've been with the force for over 15 years. She let the words settle, watching as the color drained from his face, as the weight of realization dawned on him. "And today, I'm here in my personal time. I'm waiting for my sister, who's celebrating her birthday. But I didn't think I needed to explain that." Jake felt a wave of shock, followed by a deep sense of embarrassment that settled heavily in his chest. He opened his mouth to respond, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. He had misjudged her entirely, allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment, and now he was standing before a seasoned police captain, a woman who understood his job better than he did. As the silence stretched between them, Maya's expression softened. She could see the discomfort in his eyes, the way he was struggling to process what had just happened. But instead of chastising him, she placed a hand gently on his arm, her voice carrying a tone of reassurance. "We all make mistakes, Officer Carson," she said. "The important thing is to learn from them. Remember, authority isn't about projecting power. It's about respect, understanding, and sometimes about stepping back to see things from a different perspective." Her words were gentle but impactful, leaving Jake standing in a mixture of relief, shame, and a newfound sense of humility. He felt as if he'd been stripped down to his core, his illusions of authority shattered. Yet somehow, he sensed he'd gained something valuable. "Thank you, Captain," he managed to say, his voice low, filled with respect he hadn't previously felt. Maya nodded, stepping back slightly, allowing him the space to collect himself. She glanced at her watch, and then back at him. "I hope that the next time we meet, it'll be under better circumstances," she said with a warm smile. Then she turned to leave, heading toward the restaurant entrance just as her sister emerged, oblivious to the interaction that had just taken place. Jake watched her walk away, his mind swirling with everything she'd said. In those few brief moments, she had offered him a glimpse into a different way of seeing the world, a perspective he'd never considered but one he knew he needed to understand. And as he stood there, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude, realizing that this encounter would shape him far more than he'd initially anticipated. Reflections and revelations. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cobblestone streets as Jake Carson watched Captain Maya Thompson disappear into the restaurant. A strange emptiness settled over him, an uncomfortable blend of regret, self-doubt, and a growing awareness that he'd just experienced a moment of reckoning. His fingers traced the edges of his badge, the symbol of authority he'd worn proudly since his first day, and for the first time, it felt strangely foreign, like a heavy weight that demanded more than he'd initially thought. As he turned to resume his patrol, his mind lingered on her words. She'd been kind enough to let him down gently, to leave him with advice rather than admonishment. Yet Jake felt the sting of his own misjudgment. He couldn't shake the memory of her calmness, her measured tone that had conveyed authority without force or hostility. For years, he'd equated authority with firmness, with the need to assert control, to demand respect through sheer presence. But Maya's approach was different, more restrained yet undeniably powerful. And the fact that she'd been observing him, evaluating his behavior, made the entire encounter feel like a test, one he feared he had failed. Back at the precinct, Jake found himself replaying the scene in his mind. He could barely concentrate on the debriefing that evening, his mind wandering back to Maya's steady gaze and composed demeanor. He realized that he'd seen something in her that he'd only caught glimpses of in his instructors at the academy, but never with such clarity. It was a quality of leadership that didn't need to be announced or projected. It simply was. And the fact that she was both a black woman and his superior only intensified his sense of discomfort, forcing him to confront biases he hadn't known he carried. After the debrief, Jake found himself lingering in the precinct parking lot, unwilling to go home just yet. He took a seat on a nearby bench, the quiet of the evening settling over him, and allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He'd always been a confident, self-assured individual, guided by his father's teachings of authority and control. Yet here he was, shaken to his core by a woman who had barely raised her voice, who had spoken to him not with anger or resentment, but with understanding. Suddenly, he felt the need to talk to someone, to make sense of the turmoil swirling within him. His closest confidant in the department was Officer Raul Gomes, a veteran officer with 15 years on the force. Raul was known for his cool-headed approach, his ability to diffuse tense situations with a steady hand, and a quick sense of humor. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Raul, who picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Carson. Didn't expect to hear from you after hours." Raul's voice came through, warm and familiar. "Hey, Gomes," Jake replied, trying to keep his tone casual. "You got a few minutes? Something happened today, and I could use a bit of perspective." Raul chuckled. "Perspective, huh? Sounds serious. Meet me at Java Joe's. It's quiet there this time of night." 10 minutes later, Jake was seated across from Raul in the dimly lit coffee shop, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Raul took a sip of his drink, giving Jake a long, knowing look. "All right, what's eating you, kid?" Jake took a deep breath, then began recounting the incident, leaving out no detail. He described Maya's calm composure, her piercing questions, and the slow, dawning realization that he'd been speaking to a superior officer without knowing it. Raul listened intently, nodding occasionally, his face impassive. When Jake finished, there was a long silence as Raul leaned back, taking in the story. "You messed up," Raul said finally, though his tone held no judgment. It was simply a fact, delivered with the same matter-of-factness he brought to everything he did. "I know," Jake replied, feeling a pang of shame. "But it's not just that I messed up. It's why. I let my own assumptions take over. I didn't even think to see her as anything other than a potential threat. I don't know, Raul. She threw me off." Raul leaned forward, his eyes softening. "Look, Jake, there's something you gotta understand. In this line of work, you're going to meet people who challenge everything you think you know. People like Captain Thompson. She's got layers you don't see right away. And authority. It's not what you've been taught. It's not about being in control all the time." Jake felt the weight of Raul's words, sensing a lesson in them, though he couldn't quite grasp it fully yet. "What do you mean by not being in control?" Raul smiled, a hint of nostalgia crossing his face. "Back when I was a rookie, I had this old sergeant. Real tough guy, but he taught me something valuable. He said, 'Gomes, if you want respect, show people that you're willing to listen. Not everyone needs to be handled with force. Authority doesn't mean you have to be the loudest or the toughest. Sometimes, it's about being the one who can see people as they are, who can step back and give them a chance to show who they are." Jake nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. "I guess I was so focused on proving myself, on being in charge, that I forgot to actually see the person in front of me." Raul chuckled. "Yeah, that's common. But trust me, you're not the first to go through it. And that captain, Maya, you said, she probably saw herself in you. Maybe she was just like you once, trying to prove herself." Jake sat back, considering Raul's words. Maya had given him a lesson, yes. But there had been a certain empathy in her approach, a willingness to offer advice rather than reprimand. It was as if she knew he needed this, that she'd been waiting for him to realize it himself. It struck him then that perhaps Maya had gone through similar experiences, had faced assumptions and biases, and had emerged stronger because of them. Across town, as Jake wrestled with his introspection, Maya sat with her sister, Camille, at a quiet corner table in the French bistro. Camille was in the middle of a story about her new job, but Maya's mind drifted back to her encounter with Jake. She hadn't expected it to shake her as much as it had. She was used to dealing with younger officers, used to encountering those who struggled with the responsibilities of authority. Yet something about Jake's determination and his misguided attempts to assert himself had struck a chord. Camille must have noticed her distraction because she reached across the table, touching Maya's hand gently. "You okay? You've been somewhere else for the past few minutes." Maya blinked, refocusing on her sister's face, then nodded. "Sorry, Cam. I had a run-in with a new officer today. Just got me thinking." Camille raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, tell me about it." Maya sighed, choosing her words carefully. "He was young, fresh out of the academy, I think. He approached me, probably thought I was suspicious or out of place. He didn't know I was a captain. And when he realized, you could see the shock on his face. I could see myself in him, in a way. I remember those early days, trying to prove I was tough enough, trying to assert my authority even when I didn't fully understand it." Camille nodded, understanding. "Do you think he'll learn from it?" Maya thought back to Jake's face, the way he'd struggled with the realization, the hint of self-doubt that had crept into his eyes. "I think he will. He's got potential, but he's trapped in his own head, caught up in his own assumptions. He needs to learn that authority isn't about control. It's about responsibility, about showing people you're there to protect and serve, not just command." Camille smiled, a note of admiration in her eyes. "You're good at that, you know. Seeing the potential in people, giving them the chance to grow. Not everyone would have handled him like you did." Maya shrugged, though her expression softened. "I try. But it's hard, especially when you see people struggling with the same mistakes you made. Sometimes you want to shake them, make them see it, but they have to come to it on their own. Authority. It's a tricky thing. You can't just wear it like a badge. You have to earn it, every single day." The sisters fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in thought, the quiet ambience of the restaurant a welcome reprieve. For Maya, the encounter with Jake had stirred something deeper, a reminder of her own journey, her own battles with authority and identity. She hoped that, in some small way, her words would help him find his own path, to navigate the complexities of the badge he wore. And across town, as Jake sat alone on that bench, he knew that something had shifted within him. He wasn't the same officer he had been that morning. The badge felt different now, heavier, but in a way that made him want to earn it. He knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt willing to step back, to listen, to see people as they were. Steps toward change. Monday morning arrived with a crisp chill in the air, signaling the city's subtle transition into autumn. Jake Carson buttoned his uniform with a new sense of gravity. He wasn't sure what had changed, but since the encounter with Captain Thompson, he couldn't shake the feeling that his badge was now more than just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of his responsibility, not to dominate, but to serve. His conversation with Raul had lingered in his mind, each word a nudge to re-examine what he thought he knew about being a police officer. When he reached the precinct, he noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before. The quiet camaraderie of officers sharing morning coffee, the knowing glances exchanged between veterans who had seen decades of change, and the subtle exhaustion on the faces of the rookie officers, eager but uncertain. He recognized himself in those looks and felt an unexpected kinship with his fellow rookies. As he moved to his desk, his phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at the screen and felt his pulse quicken. It was from Captain Thompson herself, a brief yet official summons to her office later that morning. Jake's mind raced, wondering if this was the fallout he had feared. Would she reprimand him formally? Would this be the end of his career before it had even truly begun? Meanwhile, across the city, Captain Maya Thompson sat at her desk, reviewing the morning's briefings and reflecting on her own career path. She hadn't expected Jake's call for a meeting to stir so many memories, but here she was, thinking back to her early days in the force. She remembered how, as a young black woman, she'd had to prove herself in ways her colleagues hadn't. Her first years had been marked by a balancing act between asserting her authority and not appearing too aggressive. And unlike Jake, she'd often faced presumptions of inadequacy simply because she didn't fit the mold of the typical officer. One particular memory came to mind. Years ago, when she was still a sergeant, she'd encountered a young recruit named Darren. Darren had struggled with anger, often approaching situations with a rigidity that alienated the community he was meant to serve. Maya had taken him under her wing, guiding him through his journey of self-awareness. She saw something similar in Jake, a desire to serve, though it was still cloaked in the armor of assumptions and rigidity. She hoped that, in her current role, she could help more young officers like him learn a different approach. When Jake arrived at her office, he felt his palms dampen as he knocked on the door, his nerves barely contained beneath his calm exterior. "Come in," Maya called, her voice clear but warm. He entered, standing at attention by her desk, awaiting her judgment. She looked up, her expression unreadable, and gestured for him to take a seat. "Good morning, Officer Carson." "Good morning, Captain Thompson," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the tension brewing within him. She leaned back in her chair, observing him with the same calm, composed demeanor he remembered from their first encounter. "I asked you here today because I want to discuss what happened the other day," she began, her tone firm but not accusatory. "I know that incident likely left you with some questions, and perhaps a few realizations as well." Jake nodded, feeling a surge of relief mixed with apprehension. "Yes, Captain. I've been thinking about it a lot. And I know I made a mistake in how I handled the situation. I assumed things that weren't true. I didn't see you for who you really were." Maya watched him for a moment, letting his words settle. "Mistakes happen, Officer Carson," she said. "The question is, what will you do with that awareness? It's one thing to recognize a mistake, but another to make meaningful change." Her words hung in the air, and Jake felt the weight of their significance. He realized that this wasn't a lecture. It was a challenge, an opportunity to prove himself in a different way. "I want to do better," he replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I want to learn how to serve the community in a way that respects them, not just enforces authority." Maya smiled, a small yet approving gesture that encouraged him. "Good. That's a start. But know that this journey won't be easy. Authority comes with responsibility, yes, but it also requires humility. You'll need to earn the community's trust, to listen to them rather than just monitor them. And sometimes that means confronting your own assumptions, even when it's uncomfortable." Jake nodded, feeling a mixture of hope and determination. "I'm willing to learn, Captain." Maya leaned forward, her eyes softening. "Then here's what I want you to do. For the next month, I'm assigning you to a mentorship program. You'll be working under Officer Sarah Molina. She's one of our best community liaisons. She's spent years building relationships with the people here, and she knows how to handle situations without escalating them. I think you'll learn a lot from her." Jake felt a flicker of surprise. Officer Molina was known for her empathy, her ability to bridge gaps between the police and the community. He'd often seen her approach interactions with a calm, compassionate demeanor, qualities he hadn't previously associated with his own role. "Thank you, Captain. I won't let you down," he said, a new sense of purpose igniting within him. As Jake left her office, he felt a strange sense of renewal, as though he was stepping onto a new path. Working with Officer Molina would challenge him, no doubt, but he was ready for it. Later that week, he met with Officer Molina for their first assignment. The task was simple on paper: connect with a neighborhood where tensions had been growing. A recent string of incidents had left residents uneasy, and the precinct wanted to rebuild trust. But as Jake observed Officer Molina in action, he quickly realized that this was more than a routine patrol. She greeted residents by name, asked about their families, listened to their concerns without rushing. She spoke in a way that invited people to open up, not pull away. They came to a small grocery store owned by an elderly couple, the Singhs, who had reported vandalism a few weeks earlier. Jake watched as Melina approached them, her tone gentle but respectful. "Mr. Singh, Mrs. Singh, how are you two doing today?" she asked, her smile warm. The Singhs relaxed, visibly comforted by her presence. Mr. Singh sighed, his face lined with worry. "We're all right, Officer Melina, but there have been kids hanging around here at night, making noise and leaving trash. We don't know what to do." Melina listened patiently, nodding. "I understand. It can be unsettling, especially when it's affecting your peace of mind. We're here to help, and we'll look into ways to make the area safer. But if you notice anything specific, feel free to call me directly. You have my number." Watching her, Jake felt a pang of admiration. She wasn't just there to take a report or offer a temporary solution. She was building a bridge, reassuring them that they had someone on their side. He realized then that this was the heart of community policing, a side he hadn't understood before. It wasn't about simply enforcing laws. It was about fostering trust, being present in a way that made people feel safe, valued. As they left the store, Jake turned to Melina, feeling the need to express his newfound understanding. "You make it look easy, connecting with people like that." Melina chuckled, shaking her head. "It's not easy, Jake. It takes time, patience, and a lot of listening. You have to meet people where they are, not where you think they should be." Jake thought of Maya's words, how authority was about responsibility, about respect rather than control. "I think I'm starting to understand," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on projecting authority that I forgot to actually connect." Melina gave him a thoughtful look, sensing the change in his demeanor. "That's good, Jake. The badge doesn't make you a protector. It's what you do with it that counts. The more you're willing to listen, to see people's humanity, the more effective you'll be. And trust me, they'll respect you more for it." Jake took her words to heart. He knew he was just beginning to unlearn years of rigid thinking, but with each passing day, he felt the shift growing within him. For the first time, he was beginning to see his role in a new light, one that felt more aligned with the man he wanted to be. Across town, Maya received updates on Jake's progress from Melina, pleased to hear of his growing empathy and willingness to learn. She hoped that his journey would continue on this path, that he would become the kind of officer who served with both integrity and understanding. In Jake, she saw the potential for change, a small but meaningful ripple that could impact the entire precinct. And she knew that as long as he held on to this newfound perspective, he would become a true leader, one who inspired others by example. The test of patience. A few weeks into his mentorship under Officer Sarah Melina, Jake Carson began to see the world around him differently. His patrols had shifted from rigid routines to genuine interactions, his once guarded stance softening as he tried to see each person as an individual, not a potential threat. Working with Melina had changed the way he approached his job, showing him that listening and patience often yielded results that force could never accomplish. But Jake was about to face his biggest challenge yet. It was a Friday evening, and Jake and Melina were wrapping up their shift. The city was bustling with weekend energy, the streets filled with laughter, music, and the occasional shouts of friends greeting each other. As they walked past a neighborhood bar, the sounds of a commotion spilled out onto the street. The patrons had begun to form a small, tense crowd just outside the entrance, where two men appeared to be in a heated argument. Jake's instincts kicked in, but unlike before, he felt a calm determination instead of a rush to assert control. He glanced at Melina, who nodded, signaling him to take the lead. This was his chance to apply everything he'd learned, and he wanted to prove, both to himself and to her, that he'd grown. Jake approached the crowd, his posture open but alert, his voice steady and calm as he called out, "All right, everyone, let's give them some space. We're here to make sure things stay safe." The crowd slowly parted, and Jake noticed that one of the men, visibly intoxicated, was raising his voice at the other. a young man who looked barely out of his teens. The young man's hands were raised defensively, his face anxious, but he wasn't engaging in the argument. He seemed to want nothing more than to defuse the situation, to walk away. In the past, Jake might have treated both men as aggressors, but now he could see the nuance. He moved closer, positioning himself between the two while speaking calmly. "Gentlemen, let's take a breath. Can you tell me what's going on here?" The older man, whose name was Tom according to the bartender, staggered as he pointed an accusing finger at the young man. This kid bumped into me, didn't apologize," he slurred. "Thinks he can just push people around. Who does he think he is?" The young man, whose name was Aaron, shook his head, looking embarrassed and exhausted. "I didn't mean anything by it. I just accidentally brushed past him on my way to the restroom." Jake nodded, acknowledging both sides. "All right, Tom," he said, addressing the older man calmly. "It sounds like Aaron didn't mean to disrespect you. Let's take a moment to breathe. No one needs to get hurt or upset over this." Tom glared at him, his fists clenching and unclenching. "You're just taking his side because he's younger, right? You think I'm the bad guy here." The frustration in Tom's voice was unmistakable, and Jake could sense that this wasn't just about a bump in a bar. There was something deeper fueling Tom's anger, some resentment simmering beneath the surface. Melina stepped forward, her presence calm but firm, and gently placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Hey Tom, why don't we step outside for a second? It's too loud in here, and I can barely hear myself think. We can talk outside where it's quieter." Tom hesitated, then nodded, allowing Melina to lead him out. Jake stayed behind with Aaron, who looked visibly relieved, yet shaken. "Thanks, officer," Aaron said, his voice low. "I really didn't want any trouble." Jake smiled, the expression one of reassurance. "I know, Aaron. You did the right thing by not escalating it. People have bad days sometimes. Just take a breather and head home if you're ready. We'll take it from here." Aaron nodded gratefully and quickly left, disappearing into the night. Jake felt a small surge of pride at how he'd handled the situation, his first major test in handling a potentially volatile encounter without unnecessary force. But as he walked outside to find Melina and Tom, he couldn't help but wonder what had caused Tom's anger to flare up so intensely over something so minor. Outside, Melina was speaking quietly to Tom, whose shoulders had slumped, his earlier aggression giving way to exhaustion. Jake joined them, staying a few steps back to allow Melina to continue leading the conversation. Tom's face softened, and he began to explain, his voice trembling. It's been hard. My daughter, she just left for college. The house is empty, and I don't know how to deal with it. I know it sounds silly, but when that kid bumped into me, it set me off." Jake listened, feeling a pang of empathy. Tom wasn't a troublemaker. He was a man struggling with loneliness, with the ache of feeling left behind. It struck Jake then that everyone carried invisible burdens, and sometimes those burdens spilled over into unexpected moments, causing reactions that were often misunderstood. This was the side of policing he'd never seen before, the understanding that each person was dealing with something beneath the surface. Melina nodded, her face soft with understanding. "Tom, that doesn't sound silly at all. It sounds like you're going through a lot. Maybe tonight's a good time to get some rest, clear your mind. And if you ever need someone to talk to, there are resources we can help you find." Tom looked at her, his expression filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you. I think I'll do that." After Tom left, Jake turned to Melina, feeling a renewed sense of admiration. "I didn't realize how much just listening could help in situations like these. It's like all he needed was someone to hear him out." Melina smiled, pride evident in her gaze. "Exactly, Jake. People don't always need to be corrected. Sometimes they just need to be heard. It's not always our job to fix people's problems, but we can give them a moment of understanding. And that can make all the difference." Jake nodded, feeling as though another layer of understanding had settled within him. He could see now that his job was less about enforcing rules and more about guiding people, helping them find a moment of peace in a world filled with noise and confusion. As the days passed, Jake continued his patrols, each interaction strengthening his commitment to serving with empathy. His approach became more intuitive, his demeanor softer. He began to build connections within the community, learning names, faces, and stories. People started recognizing him as someone they could approach, someone who wasn't there to impose but to assist. One day, he received a handwritten note from Mrs. Singh, the elderly shopkeeper he'd met with Melina weeks before. It was a simple message, thanking him for taking the time to listen and reassuring her about the safety of her store. She mentioned that his willingness to care made her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Reading the note, Jake felt a sense of pride that was different from anything he'd experienced. It was a quieter pride, one that stemmed not from a sense of power, but from knowing he had genuinely helped someone. As Jake's transformation unfolded, word of his progress reached Captain Thompson. She'd been quietly following his journey, receiving updates from Melina, and occasionally observing from a distance. She was pleased to see how far he'd come, knowing that his growth would ripple through the precinct, influencing not just him but his fellow officers. Maya herself knew the challenges of mentorship, the delicate balance between guiding and allowing room for mistakes, and she was grateful to see Jake embracing his role in the community. At the precinct, Jake's shift in attitude didn't go unnoticed. Some of the more seasoned officers, those who had previously regarded him as too rigid, began to appreciate his growth, seeing him as a bridge between the community and the force. A few rookies even began approaching him for advice, sensing his openness and willingness to help them navigate the challenges of policing with integrity. One evening, Jake found himself in the precinct's break room, sharing a coffee with Raul Gomes, who regarded him with a mixture of pride and curiosity. "You've changed, Carson," Raul said, grinning. "You're not the same hard-headed rookie who used to think he had it all figured out." Jake chuckled, a little embarrassed. "I owe a lot of that to Captain Thompson and Officer Melina. They showed me that there's more to this job than I realized." Raul nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's true. The good officers, the ones who really make a difference, they're the ones who know that real power isn't in authority, but in empathy." Jake felt the truth of those words resonate within him. He realized now that his badge wasn't just a symbol of control but of responsibility, of a duty to serve in a way that uplifted rather than oppressed. And as he looked around at his colleagues, he felt a new sense of purpose, a clarity that he'd never known before. Jake's journey was far from over, but he knew he was on the right path. He'd started with an idea of authority that was rigid, unyielding. But now, thanks to Captain Thompson's mentorship and Officer Melina's guidance, he understood that true strength came from compassion, from recognizing the humanity in every person he encountered. And as he walked back out into the bustling city, he felt ready to carry that lesson forward, to be the kind of officer he'd once only imagined, a protector, a guide, and, above all, a servant of the people. The legacy of change. A month had passed since Jake Carson began his journey under Officer Melina's guidance, and the changes within him were unmistakable. He had embraced a new way of policing, one centered on empathy, patience, and trust. Jake was no longer the rookie who walked around with rigid assumptions and a need to assert control. Instead, he had become a listener, an observer, and above all, a compassionate protector. His shift in perspective was having a ripple effect throughout the precinct. Other rookies began following his lead, watching how he handled situations with a blend of calm authority and genuine care. Even some seasoned officers, who had initially been skeptical of his new approach, started adopting some of his methods, seeing the difference it made in how the community responded. Slowly but surely, the precinct began to feel more unified, a place where officers discussed their challenges openly and leaned on one another to become better. But Jake's newfound path was about to face its most challenging test. It was a chilly Friday evening, and Jake was nearing the end of his shift. The air was crisp, the streets quieter than usual, a calmness settling over the city. He was wrapping up a routine patrol in a neighborhood park when he heard the sound of breaking glass and muffled shouting coming from a nearby convenience store. Instantly alert, he radioed for backup and jogged toward the source of the noise, heart pounding but mind focused. When he arrived, Jake saw a young man inside the store, visibly agitated, pacing between the aisles and clutching a crowbar. The store owner, an elderly man named Mr. Patel, whom Jake had met during a previous patrol, stood behind the counter, fear evident in his eyes, but otherwise unharmed. Jake quickly assessed the situation. It was tense, with the potential to escalate dangerously, but unlike the Jake of a few months ago, he felt no urge to rush in aggressively. He knew that control didn't have to mean confrontation. Jake took a steadying breath, recalling everything he'd learned from Officer Molina and Captain Thompson. He approached the entrance slowly, his hands visible, his voice calm and measured. "Hey there," he called out gently, his tone neutral but firm. "My name is Officer Carson. I'm here to help. Can you tell me what's going on?" The young man froze, his eyes darting nervously to Jake. He looked to be in his early 20s, his face drawn and pale, a mixture of anger and desperation flickering in his expression. He gripped the crowbar tightly, his knuckles white, clearly on edge. "Stay back," the young man shouted, his voice trembling. I need some cash, all right. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I need this." Jake could see the tension radiating off him. In that moment, he recognized that this wasn't the act of a hardened criminal. There was fear in the young man's eyes, a desperation that spoke of circumstances rather than malice. "Okay," Jake replied, his voice calm. "I'm not here to make things harder for you. What's your name?" The young man hesitated, his gaze flickering between Jake and the exit, but something in Jake's demeanor seemed to reach him. "It's Leo," he mumbled, lowering the crowbar slightly. "Leo, I get that things are tough right now," Jake said, maintaining his steady tone. "But this isn't the way, man. I know it feels like there's no other option, but let's talk. Let me help you figure something out." Leo's face contorted with frustration. "What do you know about it? You don't know what it's like to have nothing, to need something so bad you're willing to do anything for it." Jake felt a pang of empathy. He didn't know Leo's life, didn't know his struggles, but he recognized the anguish in his voice. It was the same desperation he'd seen in others during his recent patrols, people burdened by life's harsh realities. "You're right, Leo. I don't know what you're going through," Jake admitted. "But I'm here now, and I want to help. Hurting people or getting yourself in trouble won't solve this. Let's talk, and maybe we can find another way." Leo's grip on the crowbar loosened as Jake's words seemed to penetrate his defensive walls. Jake took a small, cautious step forward, watching Leo's body language closely. He could feel the tension in the air beginning to ease, the young man's posture softening as his breathing slowed. Just then, another officer arrived, an older cop named Frank, known for his more traditional, forceful approach. Seeing the situation, Frank quickly assessed it in his own way, his hand moving to his holstered weapon. "Drop the crowbar, kid," Frank barked, his voice loud and commanding. Leo's eyes widened, panic flooding his expression as he raised the crowbar defensively, his muscles tensing once more. The calm Jake had worked so hard to create began to unravel. Jake quickly stepped between Frank and Leo, keeping his voice steady but assertive. "Frank, it's okay. I've got this. Just give us a moment." Frank looked at him incredulously. "Carson, this isn't the time to play nice. The kid's armed." "I know," Jake replied, meeting Frank's gaze with a quiet confidence he hadn't felt before. "But he's scared, not dangerous. Please, trust me." For a moment, Frank looked ready to argue, but something in Jake's eyes made him pause. Slowly, he lowered his hand from his weapon, stepping back to give Jake space. Jake turned his attention back to Leo, who was still clutching the crowbar, but looking at Jake with a mixture of fear and confusion. "It's okay, Leo," Jake said, his voice gentle. "No one's going to hurt you. Let's just take a breath together, all right? You don't have to do this." Leo's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions seeming to catch up with him. He took a shaky breath and let the crowbar fall from his hands, his face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Jake stepped forward slowly, his hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. "You did the right thing, Leo," Jake said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "This took courage. I know you're going through a lot, but we'll figure it out together." Leo nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, officer. I don't know what I was thinking." As Frank moved in to secure the scene, Jake stayed by Leo's side, offering a reassuring presence. Leo's actions were wrong, but Jake knew this was a person, not just a criminal. He saw him for who he was, a young man in need of guidance, compassion, and a second chance. Later that evening, back at the precinct, Frank approached Jake, his usual gruff expression softened. "You did good out there, Carson. I don't know if I'd have handled it that way, but maybe I should start thinking differently." Jake smiled, feeling the warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks, Frank. I think we all have room to grow." The impact of his actions spread through the precinct quickly. Officers who once saw empathy as a weakness began to recognize its strength. They started handling their own calls with a touch more patience, a bit more openness, and the precinct slowly began to feel like a community within itself, an environment of mutual respect and understanding. Word of Jake's handling of the incident reached Captain Thompson, who felt a deep sense of pride as she observed the quiet transformation unfolding around her. She had spent years building bridges within the community and within the force, but seeing her influence spread through young officers like Jake was a confirmation that her work would live on. One evening, as Jake prepared to head home, Maya stopped him in the precinct hallway, her face lit by a quiet smile. "I heard about what happened with Leo," she said, her voice filled with approval. "You handled it well, Officer Carson. You're becoming the officer I always knew you could be." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, humbled by her words. "Thank you, Captain. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. You showed me that being a good officer means more than enforcing rules. It means seeing people, really seeing them." Maya nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad you see that. One day, you'll be in a position to pass these lessons on, to guide others. The best legacy we can leave behind isn't in our record, but in the people we inspire." As Jake left the precinct that night, he looked back at the building with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew his journey was far from over, that he'd continue to face challenges and mistakes. But he was ready. He was determined to be a force for good, to serve not just with authority but with compassion. In the weeks and months that followed, the community began to see the difference. They felt safer, not just because of the presence of officers, but because those officers treated them as people, not problems. Jake continued his work with the same dedication, building trust, fostering connections, and leading by example. And whenever he felt uncertain, he would remember Captain Thompson's words, reminding himself that true authority was earned through understanding, that his badge was a symbol not just of power, but of responsibility. He'd become not just an officer, but a protector, a guide, and a symbol of hope for those who crossed his path. And in this, he found a sense of purpose he had never known, carrying forward Captain Thompson's legacy and creating one of his own, a legacy of empathy, respect, and unwavering dedication to the community he was honored to serve.